The conduct of North Korea's government often seems bizarre, outlandish, preposterous. For example, government propaganda ascribes almost godlike powers to members of its ruling family. And as we began with, it's perhaps the only country outside of the ancient world to be a formal necrocracy, a state constitutionally held by a dead leader. So it is frequently described in the Western press as being insane. But I cannot help but wonder if they are, to use Hamlet's phrase, but mad north-northwest. In other words, is it possible that its apparently irrational actions are in fact a deeply rational strategy to keep the international community in a state of hesitant confusion about how to respond to them? I mean, if faced with a rational adversary, one can consider rational options calculated to bring about logical reactions. But when faced with an irrational adversary, one is paralyzed by the inability to predict how that adversary might react and left with an impulse to try to calm, mollify, and even appease to soothe away dangerously irrational acts. Is there method to North Korea's apparent madness?
There is definitely method to North Korea's madness. And it's one of those situations where even if you don't agree with or fully understand how they see the world, that doesn't mean they don't have a strategy. Like, they tend to be extremely realist, extremely pragmatic, with aims of survival, number one, in a situation where, when the Korean Peninsula was divided, it was never meant to be permanent. So, the sovereignty of the nation is something that has been under contestation for a long time, for 70 years, for both North and South Korea. And as having risen out of the Soviet era and from under Soviet influence during that initial division, they've obviously created a track that echoes a bit of, the Maoist influences of that time. But in order to preserve that and preserve their sovereignty and preserve their nation, they have done things that, are obviously don't conform to what we would consider to be, a rules-based order and how we would want the world. It hasn't moved towards a democratic system. It's tried to preserve that dictatorial structure and that personality cult within that. But they definitely, I think part of the problem of when we're devising policy, for instance, is that we don't take North Korea seriously as a sovereign country. And so we don't afford it the agency of having actual strategic interests. Even for those of us that work on North Korea issues and stuff, if we spend too much time trying to understand how the North Koreans view the world, it's very easy to label us as sympathizers, but it's like, how do you expect to ever have effective policy if you don't understand how your adversary is viewing the world, right? So I think, there's more predictability in North Korea's actions than what is necessarily presented in news media, in pop culture. But again, it's one of those issues where it's very difficult to get that information or to have access to that information or to find that information. And it takes more effort than it does on other issues. But yeah, there's definitely, we've seen how the strategy has evolved over time. And, from Kim Il-sung era to the Songgun era of, military first policies of Kim Jong-il, to when Kim Jong-un under Byung-jin, there was a very different sort of tone and tact and strategy and ambitions that Kim Jong-un had that his father didn't have. Because, you know, he's of a different generation. He never lived through the hardships and struggles that his grandfather and his father did, and has a much different vision of where he wants North Korea to go. We've seen him, you know, veer from the traditional rhetoric, from the traditional, some of the traditional Juche ideology and ways, testing out how far he can change, how far he can go, but, you know, without greater opportunities. You know, we've seen in the past couple of years a sort of retrenchment into some of those old ways.